Read the Israeli press, I said. Listen to Israeli podcasts. This was my rallying cry during the war in Israel a few weeks ago, when congregants or friends would call me upset with what they were hearing about Israel on the news. And I said, there's better news to read from Israel. You'll get a wider range of perspective and things like the Times of Israel and Haaretz and Jerusalem Post. So I take my own advice. I listen to Israeli press podcasts and read the Israeli press. And then I heard something that upset me. It wasn't about Israel, it was about America. Yossi Klein Halevi, who's an Israeli author and speaker, very well known from America originally, was on a podcast at the Shalom Hartman Institute talking about us, not about the war in Israel, but a week or two after the war, talking about how concerned they were about anti-Semitism in America. And I'm like, I'm supposed to worry about them. They're not supposed to be worrying about me. And he told this story. He was in the United States, though he lives in Israel at the time of the podcast. And he was at a wedding, an Orthodox family member's wedding in Brooklyn. And he said it's the first time ever in his life that he's been back in America since he made Aliyah, where he looked around the room of Orthodox Jews, many who were visibly Jewish. Like if they walked out, someone would know they were Jewish, their Orthodox garb. And he took pity on everyone in the room. He felt as an Israeli that he had a better life, not just because he was in Israel, but because right now, what Americans are dealing with anti-Semitism. And I was like, oh, I'm telling people to read the Israeli press and listen to the Israeli podcast, and I'm upset right now that Yossi Klein Halevi is pitying us, the American Jews. And then I stopped and thought for a minute. I was like, well, at least it means he cares. And at least it means that we're naming this, and at least it means we're talking about this, which is better than what's going on in the news in Israel this week, which is a lot of infighting among the Jewish people, which gets us to our Torah portion this week of Korach, which shows how good we are as a people at infighting. That if we don't realize that while anti-Semitism is one problem, that the other big problem is the infighting that happens among the Jewish people. And again, read that Israeli press and you'll see all that infighting that's going on in Israel. There's some worries that there's echoes of talk that happened before this assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. A lot of people are talking about just everyone's very riled up. And as Rabbi Levin mentioned earlier, that infighting among the Jewish people. And so you take this Torah portion of Korach, which is infighting at its best. Korach and Datan and Abiram and a whole other group of rebels confront Moses. They accuse him of something that is false. They accuse Moses and his brother Aaron of feeling that they exhibit haughtiness, that they act like they are greater than the rest of the Jewish people, which can be farther from the truth. And so Moses tries to talk to Korach, which is a really good thing. Like if there's miscommunication, talking is the best thing to do. But Korach refuses to talk, and then they have this big kind of fire pan festival, and ultimately the ground swallows up Korach and his revelers. I don't think that's going to happen to those in Israel who are rebelling against each other. But I think we can learn a couple of lessons from this Torah portion. First of all, we can learn that what Moses does is attempting to talk is something that's really important, whether we talk about infighting among the Jewish people or about anti-Semitism in the world at large. Ben-Gurion said during World War II, we're going to fight the Nazis like there's no British, because the British were having the British mandate in the land of Palestine, and we're going to fight the British like there's no Nazis. We as a people can do two things at once. So we can do the opposite of what happens in this Torah portion and talk amongst each other. But we also have to talk about anti-Semitism. As much as it made me sad that Yossi Klein Halevi pitied me and the rest of us and those people at his wedding, it's important to know that. It's important to know that Israelis are thinking about anti-Semitism and are concerned by anti-Semitism, and maybe it means that we need to think about anti-Semitism maybe a little more than we do, not in a way that's so worrisome that it drives us crazy, but in a way that we reflect on what can be done. Can we talk to people who are white supremacists, who follow these awful diatribes? Not really, but there are some people who were at one point anti-Semitism that do come speak to Jewish communities and ADL and AJC and all these places and talk about the hate that they were raised on or they were indoctrinated with and how they've changed. But another thing we can do is what Temple Bethel did earlier this week with bringing in former special envoy on anti-Semitism, Ilan Carr. We can educate ourselves. We can know that there is government and there is law and there are people who are working really hard to combat anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. And it is everywhere. It is online, it is in foreign countries, and it is here in this own country. But rather than being scared, we need to educate ourselves. We need to listen and hear what's going on. And here's what gives me the ultimate comfort about talking about this topic of anti-Semitism. The Torah portion is Korach. But this week's Haftarah, the reading from the prophets that is read, is this reading where God is really upset with the Jewish people because they've decided that they want an earthly king, right? They want a king on earth. God is supposed to be Malkeinu. God is supposed to be the one and only king. But the Jewish people decide that they want a king like all other nations. God's not so thrilled about this, but God, you know there's a King David and a Solomon and so on. So you know the people won and there was a king. But there's a great quote by Thomas Paine that says that in absolute governments, the king is the law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. And so as we battle the battles against anti-Semitism, we have to remember that we live in a country that, God willing, has laws, has the right people in the right places to do the right things, to make sure that one day anti-Semitism is a distant memory. And until that time, keep listening to the Israeli media. You can listen to the American press as well, but be aware and fight those both battles at once. Help keep peace among the Jewish people, but at the same time be aware of what's going on in the world around you. Otherwise, we end up with a situation that is not so good, like in this Torah portion of Korah. Shabbat Shalom.